Hello everyone and welcome to the third SSP webinar of 2020. You are joining us today for Building a Sustainable Research Infrastructure, What Comes Next, which is a Scholarly Kitchen webinar. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group. We're pleased that you could join us today. In a moment, we'll get started and you'll hear from our moderator and our panelists. You'll be seeing the SSP splash screen and our sponsor until we get started. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the questions feature to send in your questions, or if you need to let us know that you're having technical difficulties. The moderator will review your questions and present them to the panelists. To help her, please specify to which presenter you'd like your question directed, and please send your questions in as we go. At the conclusion of today's session, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinars program. You'll also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and to any materials. Our moderator today is Alice Meadows, NISO's Director of Community Engagement, who's responsible for engaging with the developing the NISO community members. She was formerly Director of Communications and Director of Community Engagement at ORCID, and before that, she worked for many years in scholarly publishing, including at Wiley and Blackwell Publishing. Alice has served twice on the board of the SSP, as well as on the Council of Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers. She received the SSP Distinguished Service Award in 2018, the ALPSP Award for Contribution to Scholarly Publishing in 2016, and the ISMTE Recognition Award in 2013. Now I'll turn the webinar over to Alice so that she can introduce the panel and get us started.
Thanks, Jeff, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here. This is a topic that's very close to my heart and also close to the heart of our speakers. I'm really happy that we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers here. I'm not going to do quite such a full-blown introduction to them as Jeff just did, but I am going to ask them as they each start their presentations to give a little bit of context for the perspectives that they're going to bring to this discussion. And as I said, I'm delighted to welcome, because they all have sort of multifaceted perspectives that are going to be really interesting and useful, I think. So just going left to right on the screen, Liz Allen is Director of Strategic Initiatives at F1000 Research. Liz is somebody I've known for some time, and she is very passionate about the need for a strong and sustainable open research infrastructure, as indeed are all our panelists. Phil Jones has a long history of working with technology and product and engagement, including at Digital Science, and is now a consultant at Double L Digital. Gabriela Mejias and I work very closely together at ORCID. We were in the same team, so I'm delighted to welcome Gabby, and she is Argentinian but living in Germany, so she brings a very wide-ranging perspective on this. And then Karen Wolf is actually, together with Phil, is a fellow Scholarly Kitchen chef and also an ORCID board member, and she and I work together particularly on Peer Review Week every year. So they're all going to bring great perspectives, I think. I am now going to share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I see it.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we are going to start with a question for all of you. So if you can go, just take a minute or so to go to this address. Hopefully you've all got on your, well, you are obviously all on your laptops, so you've got phones or something, and enter this code. And then we're going to take a look and see, because one of the things that we're going to do here is try and answer this question, but we thought it would be helpful to see what sustainable open infrastructure means to all of the attendees first. So while you're working on that, I am going to magically show you what you all think. Good words so far? Excellent. I love sturdy. I've never thought of sturdy as a word to describe an infrastructure, but it's brilliant. Excellent. Okay, I am going to switch back to the webinar now, but we will make the slides available, including these slides afterwards, so you can see. But you can see there's some nice, really nice words coming out here around things like standards, persistent, credit, flexible, accountable, reproducible, all the kind of words that you would expect. Although I'm intrigued, or I don't disagree with expensive, but that's an interesting one to put down as well. Okay. So we will go back now to the main presentation, and as I say, what we want to do, we decided to do, was to ask all our speakers to answer the same 3 questions. The first of which is the one that we've just asked you. So, what does a sustainable open infrastructure mean to you? We've also asked them to share an example of how that infrastructure is working, or if they prefer not working in practice today. And then, last but not least, what would their one wish be for how to change the research infrastructure? So first up is Liz, and as I say, Liz will introduce herself with a little bit more context of her expertise in this area, and then
set up everything for the set up what? Set up the present thing.
Mute. Liz, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, I was just waiting for the...
Off you go, thank you.
Background. Yeah, okay. So Alice, just to clarify, you've got the slides, yeah? So I'll just say next slide, yeah?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, thank you everybody for inviting me to discuss this issue. It's a really important issue that I've been involved in for some time. So my role, I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives at F1000 Research, and we are essentially an online, we call ourselves open research publisher. So everything we do relies upon information and metadata around research outputs that is published online, and it's open, it's for others to use all the parts of it. We want everyone to kind of build upon the research that we publish. So a key thing for us is that the infrastructure is open and easy for others to use. And by that, we're kind of talking about the content essentially of the research. Just as a bit of background, I started out, I've got a funding background. I've worked with Crossref and ORCID over the years. So funding information and metadata is really important to the scholarly infrastructure. And I think some of the things that we're going to discuss today are related to how we define and what we decide is scholarly infrastructure, which I think is part of the challenge and also a massive opportunity for us to start to try and address some of the issues that we're all going to be talking about. So in terms of the first question, what does it mean to me, to us around open research, sustainable open research infrastructure? I think one of the key things I always talk about when we're discussing these kind of issues is what are the aims of the infrastructure in terms of what it means. So the whole point, I think, of whatever we define as scholarly infrastructure is to increase the discoverability of research so that we can find it. This is what the infrastructure, I think, is for, to allow us to use that research. And we hear a lot about the terms fair information, so fair data, it's often used. So it means that information is findable, accessible, and reproducible. One of the key things for the scholarly infrastructure as well is that we want to make things connected and easy to exchange information, to share information. So a lot of the administrative burden for researchers, for institutions, for funding agencies, for learned societies in accessing and finding information, but also publishing that information is complicated, and it relies on multiple systems that often don't speak to each other. And I think one of the aims that we should be trying to do when we talk about scholarly research infrastructure is to reduce that burden, try to make that a simpler thing to work with. And I think because we have set up, we have lots of different systems that don't talk to each other. It's very fragmented, and the whole point, I think, is that we need to address is that we need to try and make things much more interoperable and usable and connected. And the systems that we work with have often evolved in a very organic way without us thinking about how now in an open science kind of digital world that we actually want to connect it together. So some of the issues that we face now is almost retrospectively trying to connect things together that hadn't been designed to be connected together, which I think is another big problem. And I think it all goes back, the big thing for me is that what we're trying to do again is increase discoverability and usability, but ultimately for the benefit of research. That's why we do research. We want to be able to understand the world, make knowledge, use knowledge, and have impact and have return on what the investment that we've invested in the research. Could you press the transition there, Alice, please?
Sorry.
No, sorry, can you go back? Sorry. So the questions for me, I think some of the things that it would be good to discuss today, I think we don't really know what we class as scholarly infrastructure. We talk about research infrastructure, but it would be good. I don't think the world, because of the reasons of fragmentation and the fact that research is done across multiple stakeholders and there are lots of people involved, which is great, but I don't think we understand what we all mean by scholarly infrastructure, which I think is a key thing in us taking forward how we address that. We need to really know what we mean, what counts, which things where we should focus, and I think that the questions that I've posed underneath. So who decides on what we're going to address? How do we get people to move forward together on some of these things? Who controls and manages the different pieces of infrastructure? So we have publishing infrastructure, we have internet bibliographic databases, we have funding data, we have lots of pieces of infrastructure, software, manuscript submission systems, ORCID, lots of things that all kind of sit within the whole frame of what might be classed as scholarly infrastructure, but who controls and manages those and how are they funded? So who pays is really, really important here. And I kind of really appreciate that someone put the word expensive on that word cloud at the beginning, because yeah, that is something that's really, really interesting. And do we try to address everything at the start? So I think the aims of the scholarly infrastructure goes back to my question at the bottom. I think this is where we should be aiming. I think to be the foundations of an effective research system, in my head, that's where scholarly infrastructure plays a major role. But I think we hadn't really set out with a system designed with that in mind. So I had a nice slide. So interoperability is something that I think is fairly tractable across a lot of things, and there's a lot of movement in this space. This is one thing that I think is working well. So if you press next slide. So the second question is around examples of working well. I think obviously we're talking about this a lot, the recognition that this is a really important issue that needs resolving. We need to start thinking about how to do this, otherwise we are creating lots of complications and things that don't sit together, and we're making things really complicated for ourselves as a system, as a research system. There are more movements around trying to develop standards and definitions. But again, I think it goes back to my previous slide. I think one of the issues around standards and definitions is whose standards and definitions are they? Do they always have to be community-based? How do we get buy-in? And some of those discussions are not easy to have and not easy to get everybody to agree. And maybe that's okay in a lot of situations. But I think when you're building infrastructure, you almost need to think about why, what is it that we're building, and who's got buy-in, and not to create barriers or people that aren't involved in certain things that to the detriment of others. It's really important to do this well. And there are a number of initiatives, particularly just for interoperability across the systems that we currently have, but I always have a feeling that we're retrofitting. If we'd thought about it in a more practical, strategic way from the start, we might not have had to have so many of these initiatives. So I think there's something there about thinking about more strategically going forward how we build this infrastructure. So what is working not so well? These are some of the things that I think as a community and an SSP and lots of the organisations that we're working and talking about this issue now we need to do. Not easy at all, but there probably are some quicker wins, and again, that's something that I'm always kind of got to the stage in my career that I realised that if you try to solve everything, you'll get nowhere. So there are some areas that I think are more tractable than others. Again, so I think things like setting priorities, this is where we need to do things. We need more work. While we are recognising the need for standards and definition, it needs a lot more work. We need to make sure that we're taking people with us and getting buy-in, but also not trying to solve every issue all at once. Supporting uptake and adoption of infrastructure and standards and definitions. a key thing again comes back to how do we fund this infrastructure? How do we fund even these small steps? And that's a massive thing. Making sure that everyone's aware that these things are going on, so you kind of get involvement and buy-in from the start, because there is nothing more concrete for implementing things if you've involved people who are going to be doing the implementing. So if you're changing things and introducing new things, you need to involve people from the start to make sure people are aware of what implications and how it will work, and to also get input into how infrastructure might develop. And I think the key thing again is to avoid too much fragmentation of new initiatives aiming to solve infrastructure that we don't know about, are not funded for the long term, and it goes back into the loop. So I think it's really important that we don't add to this whole complexity of scholarly infrastructure by yet more fragmentation. So that's next slide. So I have a comment here at the Alice, we just pressed the slide. Yeah, sorry, no, back one. Go back one, sorry, Alice. Okay, so just in terms of so I think the key thing here for me is to avoid fragmentation without sustainability. Next slide. And then quickly, so the things that I couldn't do one thing, so I've just gone for, these are some things that I think are really important, and I'm sure we'll touch on these. So more dialogue and harmonization around what actually we need to do, where we can make a difference. Some common standards, and I think one of the ways to think about common standards is, rather than trying to make things too complicated, could we agree on minimum standards for certain types of infrastructure? Metadata is absolutely going to be key for open science. We can't do it without this metadata infrastructure. So we have to do something, we have to link things together. That's really important. And I think the key, again, it needs to be funded at source and for a long term. It needs to be treated as part of the whole research system, infrastructure, whatever that is, whether it's metadata around content, systems that allow researchers to work. It needs to be funded for the long term, and it needs to be part of the research system. And I think that's kind of my last quote. Developing and funding the infrastructure just is so essential, and I think we've got to a position where we're retrofitting, and it's really problematic. So we need to start thinking about it more as an integral part of research. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Liz. Sorry for the problems with progressing slides. My laptop's doing weird things, but anyway, thanks so much. Great points, and I hope we'll have some time to discuss them at the end. But for now, move on to Phil. And Phil, if you could just say a little bit about your background before you launch into your slides.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks for that great first presentation there, Liz. So my name's Phil Jones, and I am an independent consultant. My company's called Double L Digital. My background, I think, is really pertinent here in terms of I think we're all going to be saying very similar sorts of things about infrastructure and fragmentation and persistency and things like that, but perhaps from slightly different perspectives, owing to our different backgrounds. I myself am formerly an academic researcher, although I've spent a good chunk of my career working in technology and product in publishing at places like Digital Science. I was at Journal of Visualized Experiments a long time ago, and most recently at Emerald Publishing as their CTO for a while. So speaking about my background as a researcher, I want to introduce a concept that I often think about. If we can have the next slide now, Alice. There we go, that's the one. All right, so this is the idea of the scholarly value stream. Now, this is a little bit different to the publishing supply chain that a lot of people talk about, which is about how content gets from somebody who writes it through to somebody who reads it through intermediaries like publishers and libraries and so forth. But instead, this is my thoughts about how a piece of research, an idea, starts its journey very often with a single researcher or a group of researchers having an idea, and then certainly in the disciplines that I'm most familiar with, they would write a grant and then it would get funded. That would result in certain types of outputs, not just written articles, but things like data and computer programs and all sorts of different things. Then it would turn into a research article, which in a sense is kind of the flag that people plant to say, this is the thing that I did. And then other kind of objects sort of hang off of that in a sense. And then downstream of all that, it has some kind of impact, whether that be societal benefit or economic impact, or more immediately, it would help a researcher get their next piece of funding or support the institution in some kind of assessment or evaluation framework. If we move to the next slide. But that's not what happens, as Liz said, or that's not what has traditionally happened. As Liz said, we end up with a slightly fragmented infrastructure that makes it really hard to kind of join the dots of that journey, if you like, that value stream journey. So what we've often had in the past is something like we look on the left of this slide and we have a series of buckets of stuff, right? Traditional journals is the one that we might immediately think of, but more recently we have things like repositories and data services and so on. And then over on the right, we have indexes, the places where you might go to look up that stuff. And that works fairly well to a point. You can look at ANI indexes and library records to find particular articles. But if you want to figure out what a researcher has done, you might need to look at their individual CV. Or if you're an institution, you might need to look at your research management system to figure out what your research activity is. So with all of these things being in separate places, it's very hard to make things be interconnected and interoperable. And a really good infrastructure would be both persistent, so that those records are always pointing to the right place, and it would also allow cross-referencing so that you could ask more interesting questions. So you can imagine that where I'm going with this is persistent identifiers, exactly. So once you've got an infrastructure that's based on persistency and metadata and interoperability, you can start to answer questions. Now, just looking at the first question over here on the left, what percentage of articles published by a university are open access? Now, this, to my understanding, is a question that universities in Finland currently have to ask and answer and report to the government. And having spoken to some people who work in research management and IT over there just recently, they tell me that they had to do an awful lot of manual work curating things to find out, what percentage of articles were open access. Now, that's an awful lot easier if you, for example, have that licensing information that's in a DOI that's connected into the ORCID and then associated with the grant number, perhaps, and then, and the institutional identifier. But with several gaps in that stage missing, particularly the institutional identifier, no institutional identifier being present in say, an open access or a data repository, it became very hard to answer those sorts of questions. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of all sorts of things that people might want to ask, whether they are a funder trying to understand the impact of their research, or institution trying to align themselves with a mandate, or a researcher trying to figure out whether they have also satisfied some kind of mandate or some kind of assessment protocol or something of that nature. So those are the kinds of use cases that a persistent and solid and rigorous infrastructure can create for us. So looking at the next slide, this kind of starts to slide into that question of what's working and what isn't working. I've been involved recently in a project looking at the persistent identifier landscape, and one of the things that we did there is broke it up into a number of different entities, if you like, and those are the entities that would need persistent identifiers, and they would need metadata around them. And as you can see, it's a little bit of a patchy landscape, if you like. You have things like ORCID, and you have things like Crossref and DataCite and DOIs, which are doing a really good job of being, the accepted identifier and the accepted structures for certain things like people and research outputs. But then when you get into institutions, there are a couple of candidate persistent identifiers, but there's nothing that's an accepted standard currently. Then you get into things like grants and projects where it's very much there's work being done, and it's all great work, but it's certainly early days. So moving on to the next slide, I thought about in terms of what sustainable infrastructure means to me, what some of the requirements are for a sustainable infrastructure. And certainly thinking about the persistent identifier piece, one of the things that I think is really critically important is that the governance models around these things have to be multi-stakeholder. And the reason for that is because when you look at the requirements for something, for example, a grant identifier, those requirements don't just come from funders, they would come from institutions, they would come from publishers, they would come from individual researchers, all the people who have a use case and all the people who interact with those objects. They need to feed into the requirements around the metadata, they need to feed into the requirements around things like the APIs so that things can be interoperable and people can answer the kind of questions that they're looking to answer. Openness is about the fact that you can't be reliant on a single organization. I think there are obvious business continuity reasons why that's the case. Financial sustainability, as Liz talked about and somebody mentioned, expensive. There is no such thing as a free lunch. So things like membership usage models or whatever it happens to be needs to be thought about. And then things have to be usable. They have to provide value for the community, because if they don't, they won't get adopted, they won't get used. So next slide, please. So in thinking about a positive example of something that's working, we could talk about things like, and we are talking about things like Crossref, which are doing a fantastic job of looking after DOIs and minting DOIs for research articles, and there are organizations that are doing a really good job of building that infrastructure. But I wanted to highlight an example of the use of infrastructure that kind of gives you a sense of where we can go with this and how beneficial this can be. This is a project called Core. It is a search engine that cuts across institutional repositories and allows people to search across them all in a way that really hasn't been previously possible. It kind of answers that discoverability challenge that a lot of people talk about with institutional repositories. But more than that, what it has is a really great API which allows a developer not only to embed Core's single search box into their into whatever platform or whatever product you might be building, but also is very useful for things like text mining. So this is a way in which a robust infrastructure with standards has enabled somebody to create a portal, to create a link, if you like, that enables the reuse of that metadata and the reuse of that data in interesting ways to answer really good questions. So if I could change one thing, this is the magic wand question. I was torn actually, because it's really hard to think of a single thing that you might change, because there's lots of really good work that is being done and needs to be done. But what I settled on is basically the sense that I think we need a set of really well-governed, well-adopted and interoperable persistent identifiers, and the metadata needs to be appropriate for all of the use cases and workflows that people have. And if I were to pick a starting point, it would be with institutional identifiers, because I think the lack of a well-adopted and well-accepted institutional identifier is something that's causing a lot of friction in workflows at the minute, and would be a really good place to start. So with that, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. And I know, Gabby, you'll be happy to hear that that's Phil's #1 wish. So, Gabby, over to you now.
Thank you, Alice. And yes, what a great transition to my presentation. Thanks a lot, Phil. I'm Gabby Mejias, Engagement Manager for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at ORCID. I've been working for more than 3 years at ORCID. I'm also a member of the SSP and interested in enabling more interoperability and open research practices. My perspective is researcher-centric, I would say, and I will illustrate some of these concepts with examples from my experience with ORCID and the persistent identifier or the PID world. For me, there are some values or principles for research infrastructure to be open and sustainable. And these are, of course, openness in the sense of an open participation and open governance. ORCID is a good example of these values. Participation is open to any organization that has an interest in research and scholarly communications. And We are also governed by our executive board that is integrated by a wide range of cross-section member organizations. The majority has to be non-profit, and our executive board also strives for transparency by publicly sharing summaries of meetings, financial reports, and other outputs. On top of that, all public data on the ORCID registry is shared annually in our public data file during Open Access Week and released under a CCO waiver and for free. And also all software developed by ORCID should be released under an open source software license. Sustainability is also very important. There has to be a sustainability model in place, and community ownership and institutional participation and investment are crucial to develop, sustain, and grow open infrastructure. And before I start talking about our sustainability model, let me clarify that ORCID is a nonprofit organization, and by design, we cannot be sold. We're registered as a nonprofit organization in the US, which means we're subject to laws that forbid us from being purchased or managed by a commercial entity. And at ORCID, we rely on membership fees to finance our operations, and that's why membership is crucial to our long-term persistence vision. And in 2019, we reached a significant milestone. We reached operational financial break-even, and we also achieve a more 96% retention rate for our existing members, and continued growing our membership base. And our 2025 vision is focusing on reliability and resiliency, and we're working to engage better with our communities by improving our consortium and service provider approaches that will enable us to scale our activities as adoption of ORCID increases. Interoperability, as Liz and Phil said, is also very important to build an interconnected research infrastructure, and is also one of ORCID's core principles. We aim to transcend discipline, geographic, national, and also institutional boundaries with multiple systems and institutions adopting ORCID IDs and also the ORCID APIs. We do not compete with any other system. We allow users or researchers to link with other identifier systems and organizations to exchange data across systems, and these include those of universities, funders, publishers, societies, and many more. And currently, we have more than 700 member integrations or ORCID institutional members using our member API. Which is one of the reasons of how we've achieved also this sustainability. I was speaking on the previous point. And we're also interoperable with other identifiers like DOIs, archive IDs, PubMed IDs, and are always open to enhance this kind of cooperations. Community-driven is also one of the values I chose because, again, community ownership, it's very important. The ORCID community is very wide and includes basically everyone who supports our mission, researchers and organizations involved in research and innovation, and also the organizations that build systems that support information management. And we have benefited greatly from community involvement. As I said before, our executive board, who provides guidance to help us achieve our mission, is integrated by representatives of member organizations and to researchers, and every institutional member can vote and nominate candidates for our board. And we're currently sustained by more than 1,100 institutional members that have more. Currently, we have more than 8 million IDs registered, and we engage with a wide range of volunteers in working groups, task forces, translations, and more. And in order to take ownership and build an open, sustainable research ecosystem, we need to involve all stakeholders, and we need to acknowledge the diversity of the information and scholarly community. And at ORCID, we strive to achieve more diversity, and our executive board represents a wide variety of stakeholders across different disciplines and also different regions. And speaking of regions, we currently have a national consortia in more than 20 countries across the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and members in 45 countries. And we also offer our registry in 12 different languages. And to acknowledge the diversity in the research ecosystem and in the research practices, we also recognize a wide range of contributions, 43 to date, including journal articles, data sets, dissertation and thesis, software, artistic performance, and many more. And we also support more than 40 work and funding identifiers. And
yes. You've just got 2 minutes left.
Okay, so I'm going to go directly to the next slide, sorry. So one of my favorite examples is the Crossref datasite and ORCID auto update. And you can see on the slide how it works. A researcher connects the ORCID ID when submitting a manuscript or when depositing a data set. In a repository, the publisher or the repository embeds that ID in the DOI metadata, and then information has been granted. The metadata can be automatically connected to that ORCID record, and this is this kind of machine-to-machine connections save the researchers a lot of time and make things easy, as Liz previously raised. And according to the Crossref APIs, there are currently more than 5,000 journals depositing ORCID IDs in the metadata to register DOIs. We currently have more than 54 million works or contributions, links to ORCID record with more than 20 million unique DOIs. And most of these come from Crossref or DataCite. And next slide, please. And if I could have a wish, that will be very similar to Phil's, that will be more persistent identifiers as they make the research data fair and can lead us to a more robust research infrastructure, especially because they make data machine readable and allow for automation. But just to clarify and wrap up, persistent identifiers on their own don't solve the problems, but communities do. And persistent identifiers and information standards play not only a technical role, but a social function across the research ecosystem, as they help us, or they establish trust and transparency between organizations and individuals sharing information. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabby, and sorry for my laptop seems to have a mind of its own today. I'm really sorry for all the weird goings on. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, and I just want to thank Alice for her flexibility in managing what is clearly a challenging situation there with the slides. I know all of us are in situations right now which are not perfectly ideal, and I just want to acknowledge that we're all trying to work from home, and not all of us are working in the situation that would make this maximally effective. So thank you to everyone who is here, and also thank you to SSP and to Alice for inviting me to participate. I'm always eager to participate in conversations like this with folks like Liz and Phil and Gabby. I'm a historian, so I am definitely the slightly odd person out. I am principally a historian, but I'm also the director of an organization that's a funder, convener, and publisher in early American history. So I represent a fairly small field in the sense of scholarly infrastructure. I would argue that it's actually a quite important field. It's an important field in part because early American history is absolutely a platform and a framework for modern contemporary politics and governance. how we understand the early American past so powerfully informs and even makes possible or impossible our present and our future. So research in this field is significant in ways I think we can understand even when we look at memes about American liberty or American exceptionalism. And I think part of what I want to say today about research infrastructure comes from my intellectual disposition and my training as a historian, which is that I'm always wanting to contextualize things. That is, I'm very appreciative of my colleagues on this webinar who have asked us to think about how we define infrastructure, how we think about what constitutes research, how we have thought about creating the components of that infrastructure, because that's absolutely what I'm going to encourage us to do today in my brief time here. I also just want to make a point about what we think of as research, because so much of what is informing research infrastructure is driven by what we think about is research and how a research workflow functions. And so much of that is driven by a model of STEM work. Absolutely, very much it is the case that right now we're in this moment in COVID-19 where we are all gripped by and incredibly grateful to what science and scientists are able to do for us and to tell us. But I want to encourage us not to see historians and history as some kind of substitute for science. I am not saying that in this moment, but I am asking us to think about how if scientists are telling us key things about the virus itself, historians are telling us why its impact, for example, is so differential, why it is that this virus is affecting African American communities in ways that are absolutely outsized for the specific demographic. These are things that our historical situation can tell us and should be telling us. And when we think about research in a fairly narrow STEM model, we actually then end up thinking about knowledge in a fairly narrow way. So, you know, I like to say that knowledge is not the same as information. And a lot of what we talk about when we talk about research infrastructure is about exchanging information, but it's not always about the best ways of producing and encouraging and exchanging and sharing knowledge. So my emphasis is absolutely going to be on this kind of appreciating diversity in research and in facilitating diversity in research, because it's important for, impactful for human knowledge. So just to go directly to what open and sustainable research infrastructure means in a humanities context, I've just pointed out a few things here, and I won't walk through all of it because of our time, but just pointed out a few ways in which research workflow for a historian looks very different than it does for a scientist, whether lab-based or not. The kinds of work that we do as researchers and the kind of way in which publication sits in the research workflow is very different. For one very brief example, humanists tend to exchange a lot of research outputs in ways that are never captured with a PID. So for example, conferences and seminars are ways that humanists exchange a great deal about their research as it's in progress. And yet the publication that sits at the very end of that flow is I'm not going to say it's a minor part, it's a very, very important part, but the publication is just one piece of intensive and collaborative knowledge exchange. So when only the publication is the thing that gets captured, it really does a disservice to the humanities workflow. Liz talked about not wanting to retrofit research infrastructure, and I would say that for humanists, we're always retrofitting research infrastructure to what's been built for a primarily STEM model, and that is actually really, really unfortunate for all of us. Alice, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So when we think about examples of open infrastructure in the humanities, it doesn't necessarily look like what we're talking about for STEM. And I realize I'm like flattening out STEM here by talking about it as if it's generic and not diverse as well. So I acknowledge that for sure. But when we're talking about open infrastructure, what I'm talking about is what's available to be learned about and what's available to the field of specialists in particular, but also to a wider interested public. And one thing I'll just point to right now on this slide is that the fruits of humanistic research are often shared in public fora through blog posts or even specialist journals that have quite a wide public reach. And that's actually, we think of that as open. Is it necessarily accessible in the kind of infrastructure that's been described and defined by my colleagues? Not necessarily. Could we link it up? Yes. One of the things that I'm really pleased about that ORCID is doing is helping to move, for example, the kinds of conference and seminar participation that I've described to having possibly persistent identifiers attached to conference presentations and even conference comments, which are very intensive and research rich. Alice, if you could go to the final slide. What would I wish for? What I would wish is that we could, I mean, this goes back to Liz's comment about retrofitting and how unfortunate that is. I would wish that we could design not scalable, meaning make it large, but scalable, meaning it's flexible and able to be scaled to small. Because when we only design for the biggest, when we only design for biomed and the needs of biomed, for example, we are flattening out the critical diversity of research and publication, and more importantly, well, relatedly importantly, we are flattening out what we as a society are able to learn and to know through research and knowledge production. So something like ORCID, again, is a great example because it is a kind of quite flexible tool and instrument. It begins with the user rather than with an organization or an already existing structure. And the more flexible something like ORCID is, the more flexible it can be for a field. So that's it. That's it from me. I tried to be super efficient there, Alice, so that you can go to questions now. Thank you.
You're spot on time. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone. Those were really interesting and useful perspectives. I would like to invite everybody, all the attendees, to add any questions you might have in the questions box. I am going to set up. We have one more Mentimeter poll for you, so I'm going to set that up. But please, in the meantime, add any questions that you've got in the box, and bear with me for just a couple of seconds. Okay. So we have a question from Mike. Phil, you spoke a bit about how challenging it was for institutions in Finland to track their OA output, requiring a lot of manual intervention. How do you think? What's your explanation of how they might address this? I think it was through persistent identifiers, but could you speak a little bit more about, well, I guess about how persistent identifiers could help Finland track their OA output?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big challenges is it's very hard for an institution or anybody to automatically create a list of all of the outputs from a particular institution. And that's primarily because there is no institutional identifier. And you can go to, you can pull data from a publisher, for example, and, and search for institutional names, but they're very often a free text box. So you've got different variations on how things are written, University of Manchester versus Manchester University. And if you look at certain institutions, it gets very, very complicated. I used to work at Harvard Medical School, and I had about 4 different affiliations because everything was all, the medical school and the university, and there was, and the building was co-owned by MIT and things like that. So it got very, very complex, and things were written in multiple different ways. So it became very, very difficult to track where all of the outputs from a particular place. So that's how persistent identifiers would help. I mean, imagine just being able to go to a website and going to, perhaps a repository or perhaps a publisher's website and being able to put in, give me all of the articles that have been published by, whatever institution with this particular persistent identifier, and then perhaps you would pull all of that data from Crossref and then look at the licensing information and figure out which ones of them were open access and which ones weren't. That's a couple of different API queries, and you've got yourself an answer.
Thanks, Phil. And a nice segue from that from Hannah. If Phil's solution starts with an organizational persistent identifier, where do you see your solution starting, Karen?
Oh, thank you for that question, Hannah. Where do I see that starting? I think where I really see that starting is with a better scoping of the needs of the broadest and most diverse research community. That is, I think before we start, we have to decide what it is we really, really want to do. I go back to something that Liz said. She said this really beautifully, that we can't keep retrofitting. We're losing time, and we're also, I think, unfortunately shaping what we can know and what we can do because there were some assumptions made about whose needs need to be served. I think that the greatest need is for human knowledge, of course, and to share human knowledge really widely. But human knowledge is very different from the ecosystem of published science scholarship. So I think, do we start with organizations? Do we start with individuals? I think we actually have to start with a kind of scoping exercise. I would love to see that happen. And I'd love to see leadership of some organizations doing that.
Thank you. And another one actually for you, Karen, from Laura. She says, thank you for your point about designing to small scale. Do you have any insight into how to ensure a sufficient degree of overlap to ensure interoperability given the diversity of organizations and systems, etc., involved?
Well, there are two things. One, there are some things that we have mentioned, like PIDs, that are really actually quite flexible instruments and that can be used in all kinds of different ways. We haven't necessarily. I think it's very indicative that humanists have not thought, yay, we can use PIDs for conference programs. Nobody thought that that was really a critical thing to do. But we can and we could, and there's a good argument for why we could do that. So what that tells me is that the use of PIDs, which has been, fairly, well, anyway, it's been fairly circumscribed. The use of that could be evangelized to groups that are generally kept to the margins of these kinds of research infrastructure discussions. So the American Historical Association, the Modern Language Association, I can think of just, gobs of other associations, and HSS could be persuaded that PIDs are a way to bring the full corpus of humanities knowledge production into a more interoperable infrastructure. PIDs would be the way to do that, but you'd have to educate about why that is valuable for those communities. I think it is, actually, but that's where I would start.
Great. Thanks, Karen. That's all the questions we've got for now. We do have a little bit of time, so if you have any final questions, please do go ahead and type them into the question box. But in the meantime, we have one last question for all of you, which is this: what one change would you like to see in the research infrastructure? And if you go to back to menti.com and enter, it's actually the same code again, we'll be able to see your answers. I like that one of the answers is a definition. That feels to be achievable.
It's for everything. It seems like we have a convert.
Yes.
Interdisciplinarity, yay! Open-minded. I think we're making progress here.
Great experimentation. Wonderful. Bids for more content seems to be winning at the moment. Great, well, thank you all very much. I think that is everything that we have for all of you, unless there are any other questions, which I will just take a peek and see. No, I think that's it. Jeff and Mary Beth, back to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you again to Alice, to Phil, to Liz, to Gabriella, and to Karen for engaging in an excellent discussion today. Thank you to our sponsor, Scholastica, and to all of you for attending. Once again, please do take the time to respond to the webinar evaluation that you'll receive in your email. Your feedback helps us to continually improve this webinar's program. Please also join us for the upcoming events we have. That includes the SSP annual business meeting and awards presentation on May 20th, and the next SSP webinar in conjunction with the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, titled The Workplace Needs Work. That's on Tuesday, June 23rd. And with that, we are concluded. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.